Special Olympics actually started, the real germ of the idea started in 1963 when Eunice Kennedy Shriver held a camp at her home where they had a variety of activities. There was an emerging level of interest and excitement to find out what people with intellectual disabilities could do. It was during an era where people had been shut away, where too many people lived out of the mainstream of society. So there was no certainty what might take place. The first Special Olympics Games ever were held at Soldier Field in Chicago in 1968. They were considered a World Games in the sense that people from across the United States, Canada, and France all participated in this revolutionary event that was the brainchild of Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Indiana had roughly 100 people who attended that game, mostly coming from state hospitals and other institutions for that first ever event. There were people at the games in Soldier Field who thought that Special Olympics had a place in the world in Indiana and wanted Indiana to be one of the first. So in 1969, a volunteer group in Indianapolis organized the first Indiana Games that were held on June 5th and 6th, 1969, with track and field being held at Busch Stadium, a baseball field of all things, and then a swimming competition off-site at a different location. If I'm not mistaken, there were some preliminary grants that made the first games possible. It was a fairly low-budget affair. I think the stadium was donated by the Indianapolis Indians, and swimming was hosted by a member at his club, so that was of minimal expense. So there were very few costs. The people who participated, there were several hundred people who showed up for the first games, and they essentially attended on the budget of the agency or institution or school from who they represented. So costs were minimal and stayed in that mode for the first several years until 1974, actually, when Lilly Endowment provided a grant that paid for the first paid executive director for Special Olympics anywhere in the world. So the organization around the games, the amount of fundraising that took place to support the effort became centralized and much more focused once there was a full-time paid person on the job. It's been interesting to talk with people who participated in the first games, those first few years of Special Olympics, to find out that they were happy to be anywhere, it seems to be. There are actually a few of those people who are still around, still actually participating in Special Olympics. They're now in their 60s. And my sense is from everybody who I've talked with who was there, who was involved in the process, this was just remarkable that there was some place to go and have something constructive and meaningful to do where people cheered and I had a chance to do what I wanted to do. There were a number of very genuinely caring and dedicated people who were involved in Special Olympics from the very beginning. In fact, knowing many of those folks, there were many remarkably talented people who were drawn to Special Olympics because of their concern or caring for people with disabilities combined with their love of sports. There was also, I suspect, and I'm fairly confident of this, some fairly paternalistic attitudes about what took place at Special Olympics, that it was probably perceived as just a nice activity out in the community, not connected with any real important outcomes or benefits, but just something nice to do for people who have been excluded from everyday life. I can say, fast forward 40 years, that some of those attitudes are still prevalent, that the notion that a person with an intellectual disability is challenged to have a fully meaningful life still exists today and still is one of the greatest barriers and one of the greatest challenges for an organization like Special Olympics to overcome.